2 days away from week 3 inside the Dome, Syracuse and Purdue, a nooner on Saturday. Get excited. I'm here with Mike Carmin, and we're going to talk about everything that has to do Syracuse Purdue on this Saturday's game. We'll get into it.
Are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Matt Bonaparte here on Locked On Syracuse. Thanks for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast. I'm here with Mike Carmin of the Lafayette Courier-Journal. Last week, we had Alexis Cubitt of the Louisville Courier-Journal. Maybe we're just a Courier-Journal sponsored podcast at this point. Thanks for coming, Mike.
Thanks for having me. Louisville's also part of our Gannett family, so maybe a long time ago they just flipped the names for the fun of it.
Yeah, I guess so. So Syracuse taking on Purdue. The first question I have is, we talked a little bit pre-podcast about how preseason Syracuse fans, I think, saw this game as like, all right, well, Purdue's showing up and they're just going to whoop Syracuse in the Dome. What was the feeling looking at this game preseason and compared to what it is now for Purdue fans?
Well, first of all, Purdue never shows up and just whips anybody. So that never happens and hasn't happened a whole lot in their program history. In the off season, I think it was a game that Purdue fans looked at as a better than 50% chance of winning, and a lot of it probably was dependent on what happened against Penn State before actually Penn State happened, because there was an opportunity there for Purdue. If they beat Penn State, obviously they were going to beat Indiana State, and then you go to Syracuse with an opportunity to really stay unbeaten at that point, gain some momentum going back into the Big Ten in early October. But now that reality is here, Purdue has lost the Penn State game. Syracuse is 2-0, played very well against Louisville, minus the penalties, I guess, and then had a nice win at UConn. There's some concern on the Purdue side that they could be sitting at 1-2 with Florida Atlantic next week before jumping into Big Ten play. So I think the outlook has completely changed. The other part is that, Purdue will be without in my opinion, its best defensive player in Jalen Graham, and they have to overcome that not only this week but next week and possibly when they go to Minnesota. So when people ask me in the offseason, well, how do you think Purdue's going to do? What's their record going to be? I say, well, can you tell me who's going to get injured? What week they're going to get injured?
Yeah.
And can Purdue even replace that player? And Jalen Graham, in my opinion, is not a guy. There's not another Jalen Graham on the roster. And that's going to hurt Purdue in this game and over the next couple weeks. But I know from the Syracuse side, this has turned into a monumental game, a chance to really keep that early season momentum going. So I expect them to be, ready to go, fired up. And, and Purdue's got some things to prove here. Can they win a close game that, let slip away against Penn State if they're in that situation again? So this has become an important game, I think, for both programs right now.
Absolutely. For Syracuse, this is kind of all right, this is the test kind of game. We saw them beat Louisville, but, 2 weeks into the season, we don't really know how good Louisville is right now. And UConn was a cupcake game, so everybody expected a win there. So 2-0 was kind of a given after the first win. It's all about week 3 now against a real team that, like you said, came really close to beating a Penn State team that is now ranked 22nd in the nation. So they are in a very similar spot. But before we get into the nitty-gritty and talk player by player, can you just give the Syracuse audience just an elevator pitch on this team about who they are and what they do?
Well, Purdue is a program not just under Jeff Braum, but is a team that throws the ball. They're the cradle of quarterbacks, been that way for 60 years. I want to say they've always built their program. When they've had success, they've built their program around the quarterback and wide receivers and throwing the ball around. I always like to say that Purdue hasn't ever had the infrastructure to be a ground and pound program. They've never recruited or had success recruiting a lot of really talented offensive linemen. They've had really good backs over the years, but they determined early on in their history that quarterback throwing the ball, playing exciting football, putting up points was a way to get people into the stands and the ways to get people to the program and people to watch the games. And Jeff Braum fits that perfectly right now. He's a former quarterback, played at Louisville, all that kind of stuff. So they've continued that tradition. That's what they are on offense. They haven't been a strong running team under Jeff, in part because he doesn't commit to it. But that's, there's some things they can do there to help themselves. Their quarterback, Aidan OConnell, is a 6th-year guy. He started as a walk-on, had a chance. He could have gone to a Division II or Division III school, but wanted to walk on. He was 8th or 9th on the depth chart when he got here, but through a series of events, injuries, and stuff like that he has moved up. He wasn't even the starter at the beginning of last year, but he's a very accurate passer, has a very strong arm, has really embraced his role, not only as a quarterback, but as a leader on this team. And the team does rally around him. Now they had to replace David Bell, receiver, who's now a rookie at Cleveland. But Charlie Jones, the Iowa transfer, has really stepped up. So they filled some holes there. Defensively, when Jeff Braum first got here, the defense was pretty good, carried them for a little bit, but then they hit a lull. But the last couple of years, they've been better defensively because they're taking a more aggressive approach. But again, they've had to fill some holes from last year. George Karlaftis was the number 1 pick for the Chiefs, and he's playing in the NFL right now. They don't, Jalen Graham was their star on defense, but he's out for a few more weeks. So they don't have a lot of star power on the defense right now, but they have a lot of depth on the defensive line, which should show up on Saturday. And they've got a couple other playmakers in the back half, but nobody like Graham. But defensively, they haven't been a strong unit over their history. A lot of times they've just leaned on outscoring people. Now you go back to the Joe Tiller days, they were putting their better athletes on defense. Even guys that were wide receivers in high school, they would move over to the defensive side. And for a period of time, they were very athletic on defense. A lot of those guys ended up in the NFL, and they were able to make a lot of plays, but they still needed the offense to score some points. And I think probably old-time Syracuse fans remember the Sunday game at Ross 8 Stadium that ended up 51-0. That was a surprise shellacking. I was there, and I was stunned that happened the way it did. But I don't know if I answered your question the best of my ability, but that's
absolutely
kind of a nutshell
totally.
of what Purdue's program has been, where it's at today, and this is who they're going to be under Jeff Braum, and I think this is who they're going to be regardless of the coach.
Okay, I want to jump into Jeff Braum a little bit more, but first let me take a quick break to read a word from our sponsor, BetOnline.net. It's your number 1 source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Find all of the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this year's Week 3 college games. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. Bet online where the game starts. Alrighty, so this past season, Purdue hits the 9-win mark for the first time since 2003. In your opinion, how much of that was Jeff Braum?
Well, I mean, yeah, you got to give him credit for that. This was last year's team, again, Aidan OConnell wasn't the starting quarterback at the beginning of the year. Jack Plummer was the starting quarterback, and their offense really didn't get going, but their defense kept them in a lot of games. O'Connell eventually took over and became the starter because they ended up winning 5 of the last 6 or something like that. Only lost to Ohio State during that stretch. But yeah, he gets credit for it because of the philosophy he brought to the defensive side. He wanted it to be similar to what they were doing offensively. Hired veteran assistant coaches. One of the key coaches they hired was Mark Hagan, who used to be at Purdue under Joe Tiller back in the early 2000s. I think he's one of the best, if not the best, defensive line coach in the Big Ten and maybe the country. Ron English, a veteran, a former head coach who was at Eastern Michigan, but also was a defensive coordinator at Michigan for a long time and spent some time at Florida before he came to Purdue. So he's got a veteran staff on that side of the ball. So, he assembled the right staff on the defensive side. And they had they had playmakers. George Karlaftis had some other guys. But yeah, Jeff gets a tremendous amount of credit for the 9 wins. And, that's the way it goes. He also gets the blame for 4 wins when things didn't go well. So
that's the coach's life.
Yeah, that's the way it goes in a coaching business.
So I've only heard good things about quarterback Aidan OConnell. You mentioned he didn't start the year as the starter last year, and this year he's come in and played pretty well. Hasn't thrown a pick thus far. What do you think his ceiling is, and how does Syracuse beat him?
He's an accurate passer. Against Penn State, he only completed, I say only, but he completed 50% of his passes. That's his lowest completion percentage in any game at Purdue, either as a starter or a backup. But he backed it up last week with a nearly 90% completion percentage against Iowa State. How does Syracuse kind of beat him or rattle him? First of all, get some pressure on him. Penn State didn't get pressure early, but they were close enough to force him to throw the ball before he wanted to, maybe a split second before he wanted to, and therefore Purdue missed some plays in the fourth quarter that probably would have put that game away. He's not the most mobile quarterback, even though he has worked on his athletic ability, trying to have better footwork in the pocket. There was a play against Penn State where they ran an option that if he would have kept it, I think he would have scored, but he ended up pitching it. So he's not, I'm not going to say he's not comfortable running, but it's not his strength. But if you let him sit back there in the pocket, find his receivers, he's gonna pick you apart because he's that accurate. And if Syracuse tries to take away Charlie Jones, which they should, then he's going to have to go elsewhere to find his playmakers. And that's the question right now with Purdue's offense. Who's going to be the number 2 receiver that they can lean on? Or does that become a tight end in Payne Durham, who I think is one of the better ones in the Big Ten? But that's the question right now. Charlie Jones is going to get his targets. He's going to get his catches. But at some point, they're going to need a number 2 to step up and get it done. So if you can get pressure on O'Connell, and the other thing Syracuse has to do, they can't let Purdue successfully run the ball. They're not as I mentioned, they're not a great running team. But if they start to have success running the ball, that's going to open up more things in the passing game for them.
So before we get to the what the Boilers' running game is like, I was going to just ask you about Charlie Jones and how he's caught 21 passes and nobody else has caught more than 6. I mean, it seems pretty telegraphed in that the ball is going to him. And Aidan OConnell is going to have to deal with a really strong secondary that Syracuse has, and Deuce Chestnut and Garrett Williams. What kind of battle do you think that's going to be? And do you think they'll be successful through the air through a second target, like you mentioned?
Well, I envision them force feeding the ball to Charlie Jones early, just trying to get him going and seeing how Syracuse is going to play that. But I do think eventually, if they have success, that Syracuse is going to do everything in its power to take it away. And O'Connell's going to have to go elsewhere. I mean, it's easy to say, well, Purdue needs a number 2 receiver to step up. Well, a number 2 receiver can only step up if Aidan OConnell throws him the ball. And you have to understand the history of Charlie Jones and Aidan OConnell. They grew up playing youth football together.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
And they didn't go to the same high school, but they played youth football, youth baseball together, and their families stayed in touch. Their families are similar. Both families have 6 kids and all that kind of stuff. Charlie Jones ended up going to Buffalo, getting into transfer portal, walking on in Iowa, and then got back into the portal last spring or after spring practice, and basically hooked up with Aidan and asking Aidan, "Hey, is this a good spot for me?" And yes.
Oh.
And I mean, Charlie's been clear why he came to Purdue for the offense. He wants to showcase his skills. That wasn't getting done at Iowa, and anybody that's followed Iowa this year can understand why the offense is struggling a little bit. So they're best buddies. They're childhood friends. He's going to throw him the ball. He's going to try to get him in a situation to make plays. From Purdue's standpoint, you hope that he doesn't overdo it or tries to force something that's not there because he's convinced that Charlie's going to make the play. That can be good and bad. Purdue did the same thing with David Bell last year. They would target him often, but at some point, you've got to go elsewhere. But the other guys have to make plays as well. So I see him trying to get Charlie the ball as much as possible, and then kind of see how it plays out from there.
Sure, and 15 different guys have caught passes for Purdue this season, so the love has been spread despite one guy getting most of it. Okay, so on to the rushing attack. There are 4 players on this team with upwards of 10 carries. What is it like to have that kind of committee? Do you think it's an advantage because every guy who's going to carry the ball knows he can go 100% because he's going to get a break soon? Like, what's the story there?
Well, first of all, I don't expect all their running backs to get a carry on Saturday. King Drew's their number 1 running back. Dylan Downing is their number 2. Kobe Lewis is their number 3. I think that's probably where it ends on Saturday. King Drew's had a good season so far. He scored 3 red zone touchdowns, which was a struggle for Purdue last year when they got in the red zone. They couldn't run the ball effectively. And then Dylan Downing is a backup who's slimmed down. He's probably more effective. He's effective in the run game, but also he brings some qualities in the pass game that the others don't. And Kobe Lewis is a transfer from Central Michigan who didn't play last year, tore his ACL in training camp, sat out, and then got in the transfer portal. Purdue picked him up. They add depth, and they have decent depth at the running back position. They have more bodies than they've had in a while at that spot. There have been times in practice over the last couple of years, a running back coach would be working with 2 guys because they just didn't have the depth. So they've got more depth, but those 3 I think are the ones they're really going to lean on when they want to run the ball, and that's just kind of how Jeff Braum has done it. One of the guys is a walk-on, Devin Mockabee, he was their leading rusher last week, but it was against an FCS school. But he has some talent and he runs hard. And if injuries happen, he'll get in position to play. But I would expect the top 3 guys to get most of the plays and or carries in this game. Gotcha.
All right, let's hop on to the other side of the ball. The big story, of course, is Jalen Graham, like you mentioned before. Guy is irreplaceable. He's a linebacker, safety, can fit in anywhere, superstar on the defensive end. I've seen somewhere in some different places that some people are speculating that they might try and switch up the defense entirely. What do you think they're going to try to do to fit that hole now that Jalen Graham's gone?
I mean, I'd be surprised if they switched up the defense entirely. They have a lot of defensive linemen. They've played at least 12 defensive linemen in the first 2 games. So they have a good rotation there.
That's crazy.
Their front 4, their starters up front have been solid, but they lack a star in that unit, and they need 1 or 2 guys to emerge. They have some talented defensive ends and some defensive tackles, but they're not getting the kind of pressure that they want to get. Now it's only game 2. We'll see how it plays out over the next few weeks, but they have a lot of bodies there. They've been using them. I think Mark Hagan, as I mentioned, is one of the best. And the whole goal is to keep those guys as fresh as possible. So when you get in the fourth quarter, your starters are still playing at a high level. They're not gassed. They're not playing 80 plays. They're playing 50 or 55. And, that's where I think Purdue's defense can make a difference, not only Saturday, but in any game that they play. Their linebackers are not probably as strong as they've been in the past. But their secondary, even without Jalen, Cam Allen had a pick six last week. Sanusi Kane, who is going to be a starter now at safety. He's actually from Harlem, New York, so he's really looking forward to coming back and getting in the state, even though he's 5 hours away. So he gets a little bit of a home game. Chris Jefferson's going to take Jalen's spot. He'll play the nickel position. He's a transfer from a Division II program from 2 years ago, but he had a pick six against Penn State. The one area I think of concern is Purdue's defense is their cornerbacks. I don't think it played that well in the first two games, and they need to play better. But I don't see any kind of overhaul here. You're going to see some new faces and new bodies in the game because they do have to shuffle some people around. And the thing that I think will happen is that, in running situations, they need to get a little bit bigger. So you might see some new players with some size because you're trying to make up for what Graham brought. So there might be some new faces there, in obvious running situations where they'll be on the field.
Cool. I don't know if it's your first time in Syracuse, but the Dome is going to be packed. How much do you think the noise is going to impact the Boilermakers?
Well, I mean, it's a concern. I mean, they're practicing this week in their indoor practice facility, even though it's sunny and 85 degrees here.
Interesting.
So they're trying to prepare themselves as best as possible. Yesterday after practice, every program's got music blaring, but the speakers were in the corner of the indoor practice facility, and the offense was over there, right in front of the speakers.
Wow.
And they were playing music extremely loud, which even interrupted our interview time. But they were working on their silent counts just to try to deal with the noise. So that's something they're going to, every team that goes in there has to deal with it. And Purdue's trying to be as prepared as it can to deal with that situation. They don't play in a lot of domes. I think the last time they played in one was Braum's first game against Louisville back in 2017. So it'll be a somewhat new experience, but they're doing the best they can to, prepare for it.
I was thinking about that because, living in our Syracuse bubble, the Dome is so natural. And I was watching some press conferences and somebody asked, how are you going to prepare to play in the Dome? And I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot that was like a thing.
Yeah, you don't do it. You don't do it very much, if at all. And so, you have to take some different, when they go to Wisconsin, when they go to Iowa, when they go to some of the Big Ten schools, they'll practice outside and blare music to try to simulate a crowd noise and, the cadence and stuff like that. So it's not anything new. It wouldn't probably, Syracuse would probably next year at this time, Syracuse is going to do the same thing, practicing outside with noise because they're going to come to Ross-Ade Stadium and there's going to be 55,000 people here. So they're going to do the same thing next year, just in a different
That was what
situation.
I was going to say. Is it's the flip for us. I think somebody asked Schrader going into week 2, how's it going to be playing outside? Which I think is pretty funny. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Mike. I really appreciate it. Mike Carmin of the Lafayette Courier-Journal.
Nope, Journal and Courier.
Journal Courier. My bad. That's on me. I apologize.
That's all right.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for reaching out. Appreciate it. And looking forward to my first trip to Syracuse.
Awesome. Well, if you need any spots, I got you. You just reach out to me. I'll tell you where to go. That does it for today's episode. Thanks for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen every day. Go get more on the ACC. Make Locked On ACC your second listen every day. Host Candace Cooper and the local experts of Locked On take you across the ACC in 30 minutes. Locked On ACC. Make it your second listen, and I'll see you tomorrow.